There are 29 names carved into a bell in Mariners Church in Detroit. Every November 10th, that bell rings. Once for each man. No one survived. No distress call was ever made. A 729-foot freighter, loaded with 26,000 tons of iron ore, vanished from radar in under 10 minutes. And for nearly 50 years, the world accepted the explanation they were given. A storm, failed hatch covers, tragedy. But the lake kept it secret. And then, a drone went down. What the cameras found on that lake bed didn't match the report. It didn't match the theory. And it didn't match the story that an entire generation grew up believing. This is not the story of a storm that sank a ship. This is the story of what actually happened and why it took 5 decades for anyone to find out. November 10th, 1975, the Edmund Fitzgerald, one of the largest freighters ever to sail the Great Lakes, departed Superior, Wisconsin, carrying a full load of taconite pellets bound for Detroit. Her captain was Ernest McSorley, a veteran mariner with 44 years on the water. Her crew of 29 were experienced. The ship herself was only 17 years old. By nightfall, a massive storm had developed over Lake Superior. Winds exceeding 90 miles per hour, waves cresting over 25 feet. The kind of storm that earns names. The Arthur M. Anderson, sailing behind the Fitzgerald, tracked her on radar through the night. At 7:10 p.m., her first mate called Captain McSorley to report their position. McSorley's final words, recorded over radio, were calm. "We are holding our own." 10 minutes later, the Fitzgerald was gone. No explosion, no SOS, no debris field in the expected location. Just silence where a ship had been. The 1977 U.S. Coast Guard investigation concluded the cause: the hatch covers. 21 of them, running the length of the main deck. The theory held that waves overwhelmed the covers, water flooded the cargo hold, and the ship, already riding low, plunged to the bottom. It was a plausible story. It was a tidy story, and for 47 years, it was the only story. The problem with tidy stories about disasters is that the evidence doesn't always cooperate. The wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald lies at 530 feet beneath Lake Superior's surface, split into 2 massive sections, separated by roughly 170 feet of open water. The bow rests upright. The stern sits inverted, propeller still turning in the cold current of the deep. Early dives in the 1990s gave us images, but they were limited, murky, incomplete. The new underwater drone footage changed everything. For the first time, investigators could map the wreck with precision, running the length of the hull, hovering over the deck, examining the very hatch covers that the Coast Guard had blamed for the sinking. What they found stopped the research team cold. The hatch covers, the ones that were supposed to have been overwhelmed by storm water, supposedly the entry point for the flooding that doomed the ship, were seated properly, still in position, still clamped down where the crew had left them. If water entered the Fitzgerald that night, it didn't come in through the hatches, which meant the 1977 explanation wasn't just incomplete, it was pointing at the wrong door entirely. So where did the water come from? And more importantly, when did it start? To understand what really happened to the Edmund Fitzgerald, you have to go back further than the storm. You have to follow the ship's route. On the afternoon of November 10th, Captain McSorley made a navigational decision that seemed reasonable at the time. He hugged the northern shore of Lake Superior, a common route used for storm protection. But that route took the Fitzgerald near 6 Fathom Shoal, a shallow underwater ridge off Caribou Island. Here is where the chart becomes critical. The navigational charts in use at the time contained an error, A significant one, a section of the shoal, a stretch of dangerously shallow water, was charted at a depth that was simply wrong. Optimistic. The actual depth was shallower than any mariner following those charts would have known. Investigators now believe the Fitzgerald passed over, or dangerously close to, that uncharted shallow section during the afternoon hours, before the storm reached its full fury. The impact, if there was one, would have been subtle. Not a dramatic collision, not an alarm-triggering jolt, more like a scrape, a shudder, the kind of thing you might note and file away, unsure of its significance. But below the waterline, invisible to the crew above, the hull may have been compromised. This is where the timeline becomes haunting. By early evening, Captain McSorley had already radioed the Arthur M. Anderson with an unusual admission. The Fitzgerald had developed a list. She was taking on water. 2 of her ballast pumps were running. He described it as manageable. He was wrong. And there is reason to believe he didn't fully know it yet, because the damage wasn't on the surface. It was structural. And it was progressive. And by the time the full storm hit, the ship that faced those waves wasn't the ship that had left port that morning. She was already wounded. 7 p.m. The storm is at its peak, waves the height of 3-story buildings. The Fitzgerald is running for the shelter of Whitefish Bay. Safety was less than 20 miles away. The Arthur M. Anderson has her on radar, constant contact. At 7:10 p.m., that final radio exchange. McSorley's voice, steady. "We are holding our own." 7:15 p.m. The Anderson's radar operator watches the Fitzgerald's blip, steady, consistent, moving. 7:19 p.m. The blip is gone. No mayday, no signal flare, no debris immediately visible. No sound that any crew member on the Anderson would later describe as an explosion. In less than 10 minutes, a ship the length of 2 football fields simply ceased to exist on the surface of Lake Superior. How does that happen? Not slowly. That's the answer the drone footage forces us to accept. The Fitzgerald didn't settle. She didn't gradually fill. The sequence that ended her was sudden, catastrophic, and almost certainly structural. The leading theory now points to what investigators call a free surface effect, combined with progressive internal flooding. As water entered through the compromised hull, not the hatches, it moved freely through the lower spaces of the ship. As the bow dipped into a massive trough between waves, the accumulated water surged forward with tremendous force. The bow dove, the stern rose, and the keel, the spine of the ship, broke, not at the surface, not visible to anyone watching. Under the water, in the dark, in seconds. The 2 pieces of the wreck, separated by 170 feet, tell that story without words. 29 men, no warning, no chance. So what sank the Edmund Fitzgerald? Not a storm alone. Storms don't leave hatch covers properly seated on a sunken ship if those hatch covers were the failure point. Not negligence. McSorley was a seasoned captain, making reasonable decisions with the information he had. The real answer begins with a chart. An inaccurate, government-issued navigational chart that showed a shoal at a depth it wasn't. A chart that guided a 729-foot ship into waters that were shallower than anyone aboard knew. An impact, likely minor in the moment, that opened the hull below the waterline and began a slow, invisible countdown. And then a storm that turned that slow leak into a catastrophe. The Fitzgerald didn't lose to the weather. She lost to a hidden hazard no one knew was there, and a structural wound no one could see until it was too late. The updated findings, supported by the drone surveys and modern structural analysis, have led maritime historians and investigators to push for a formal revision of the official record. The 1977 Coast Guard report, for decades the final word, is now widely considered incomplete at best. The families of the 29 men aboard have lived with one explanation for 50 years. The lake, it turns out, had a different one. Every November 10th, the bell at Mariners Church still rings 29 times. And somewhere at the bottom of Lake Superior, in 530 feet of cold, dark water, the Edmund Fitzgerald rests in two pieces. Her bow facing one direction, her stern facing another. A ship that was broken apart so fast, her crew never had the chance to understand what was happening. We understand it now. It took drones, decades, and the courage to question an official report that the world had long accepted as closed. The names on that bell aren't just a memorial. They're a reminder that when something catastrophic happens, the first explanation offered is rarely the full story. And the truth, even when it sits 530 feet underwater, has a way of surfacing.